My name is Rachel Parker, and if there's one thing I've learned over the past month, it's that some things should remain buried. When I moved to Black Ridge County, North Carolina, I was seeking peace and quiet. As a history teacher, the idea of living in a place with such deep roots was enticing. Little did I know it would be that very past that would turn my life into a nightmare. It all started on a quiet afternoon. I was cleaning up the yard of my newly purchased house, a modest wooden structure surrounded by oaks that seemed to watch my every move. While clearing the accumulated leaves near an old arbor, I felt something hard under the shovel. I started digging, thinking it might be a rock or a piece of rusty iron. But what I found was something very different. It was a metallic object, covered in dirt and moss, shaped like an oval amulet. Its surface was engraved with symbols I didn't recognize, even with my knowledge of history. There was something unsettling about it, as if it carried an energy I couldn't explain. As soon as I held it, I felt a faint warmth pulsing against my skin, and the impression that something invisible had just awakened. I brought the amulet inside, carefully cleaned it, and tried researching it. My books offered no answers, so I took a few photos and sent them to colleagues who might help. That night, I left it on the living room table and went to bed, but my sleep was disturbed by a dream that felt so real I woke up in a sweat. In the dream, I stood in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. At the center there was a woman with black hair tied to a stake, fire rising around her. Her face was serene, almost resigned, as dozens of masked figures watched. When the flames reached her body, she opened her eyes and looked directly at me, whispering, "You have been chosen." I woke up with a scream caught in my throat, my heart racing. I looked at the clock. 3:33 a.m. In the living room, the amulet seemed to faintly glow, as if it were alive. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. Objects I was certain I had left in one place appeared elsewhere. Lights flickered without reason, and the amulet always seemed to catch my attention, as if it were begging me to hold it. When I finally gave in and picked it up again, something changed. The moment my skin touched the metal, a wave of heat shot up my arm, and my vision blurred. Suddenly, I was seeing the kitchen of a neighbor, Earl Morgan, a lonely man who lived a few houses away. He was handling a vial of poison, pouring it into a glass of wine while muttering something about money and freedom. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving me gasping for air. At first I thought it was some kind of hallucination, but when I heard the next morning that Earl had died in a strange accident, the poison he had intended to use on his wife spilled and killed him, I froze. The vision was real. I had known what was going to happen before it happened. Curiosity quickly turned into a burden. Every time I held the amulet, the visions came, growing more intense and disturbing. They didn't just reveal future events, but also the dark secrets of those around me. Lies, betrayals, hidden desires. I discovered the local baker was stealing money from his employee, that the sweet old church lady had poisoned her husband 30 years ago, and that my own best friend Sarah was planning to betray me to get a promotion. I didn't want these visions, but it seemed the amulet was shaping me, turning me into a tool to uncover truths that should have stayed hidden. When I tried to get rid of it by throwing it into a nearby river, the object reappeared on my table the next day, clean and intact. The days went by, but the amulet wouldn't leave me. It seemed to grow heavier, as if it were accumulating something. Secrets, perhaps, or lives. The visions became more intense, showing not just the future, but things I couldn't explain. Flashes of places I'd never visited, faces I didn't recognize, screams that seemed to echo from a distant past. After the last dream of the woman in the clearing, I decided I could no longer ignore what was happening. Her name, Margaret Bell, appeared in my mind as if etched in fire. I researched local library records and discovered that Margaret had been executed for witchcraft in 1683. She was accused of using an amulet similar to mine to manipulate fate and condemn her enemies. But the most disturbing discovery was this. The clearing where she had been burned was in the woods behind my house. That night I decided I needed to confront the truth. I grabbed the amulet, now pulsing with an almost unbearable heat, and walked to the clearing under the pale light of the moon. The trees around me seemed taller, darker, leaning in as if to block my path. When I arrived, I saw the site wasn't empty. Ancient stone circles marked the ground, each engraved with symbols identical to those on the amulet. At the center was a makeshift wooden pedestal, burned and weathered by time. As I approached, the wind picked up and I heard whispers around me, soft, mocking voices speaking all at once. "You've brought the amulet back. It always returns." I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to dance between the trees, and the whispers grew louder until a sound split the air, distorted laughter coming from all directions. Her voice was next. "You shouldn't have dug, Rachel. Now you belong to it." Margaret Bell's figure appeared before me, dressed as she had been in my dream, but her face was burned, her eyes black and glowing like embers. She moved closer and my body froze, as though bound by invisible chains. "Power comes at a price, but you can still choose. Pay it yourself, or pass it to another. Leave the amulet here and go, or keep it, and rule fate for a little while longer. But remember, every choice has its cost." I wanted to scream, to throw it down and run, but something inside me hesitated. The amulet seemed to vibrate in my hand, whispering words I didn't understand but which seduced me. "Control," it said. "Power." As I stood paralyzed by the decision, the clearing began to change. The ground cracked and shadows emerged from the fissures, stretching out long skeletal arms toward me. Margaret disappeared, but her laughter echoed as the shadows closed in. "Make your choice," one of the voices shouted. With a cry of desperation, I threw the amulet onto the pedestal and collapsed to the ground. The shadows stopped for a moment, as if watching me. The amulet glowed brightly, emitting a piercing sound that made my ears throb. A burst of light filled the clearing, and everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the amulet was gone, and the clearing was empty again. The sky seemed darker, the air heavier. I thought I was free. I thought it was over. I returned home, but the sense of freedom didn't last. The dreams continued, not of Margaret or the amulet, but of something greater, something beyond the clearing. A faceless figure, cloaked in black, appeared every night, pointing at me. I woke up feeling as if I were being watched. One day, as I cleaned the table where I used to keep the amulet, I found a message carved into the wood. "The collector always finds new bearers." My blood ran cold. I ran to the mirror, and for an instant I saw another version of myself, an older Rachel, with empty eyes and a smile that wasn't mine. When I blinked, the image was gone. That's when I realized I was never in control. The amulet might have been left behind, but the price remained. And it would keep watching me, waiting for the right moment to claim its due. I never expected that to happen to me. To be honest, I never believed in legends or superstitions. My life was built on facts and evidence, not ghost stories or monsters hiding in the dark. But everything changed when I got the call to investigate the case of Carl Beaumont, a man who disappeared in the dark swamp 20 years ago and returned as if no time had passed. My name is John Mathers, and I've been a detective for over 15 years. I've seen things that would make most people quit this job, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that swamp. The case started as something straightforward, a missing man reappearing. Carl Beaumont had been presumed dead 2 decades ago after vanishing during a night of fishing. When he returned, he looked exactly the same as when he disappeared. No wrinkles, no signs of aging. The problem was, Carl couldn't speak. He didn't make a single sound. He just stared at everyone with empty eyes, as if trapped in some kind of trance. The first time I saw him was in an interrogation room at the county station. He sat at the table staring at the wall. When I sat across from him, he slowly turned his head and looked directly into my eyes. I'll never forget that look. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was as if he knew something I didn't, something no one was meant to know. After a few minutes of absolute silence, Carl started scratching the table with his fingernails. At first I thought it was a nervous habit, but I soon realized he was drawing, The symbols were strange, circular, resembling some kind of ancient alphabet. Once I finished photographing them, he finally spoke. "The water waits. You mustn't go in." The words came out in a raspy, drawn-out voice, as if he hadn't spoken in years. Before I could ask anything, Carl began screaming and thrashing, forcing the officers to remove him from the room. I was left alone, staring at the symbols on the table, trying to make sense of what was happening. The name Dark Swamp appeared several times in Carl's files. It was where he had disappeared, and it seemed to be the source of all the dark tales in the area. Locals avoided the place, calling it cursed. Some spoke of spirits. Others mentioned something far worse, a cult worshipping an entity in the waters. I ignored the warnings and decided to visit the site. I arrived at the swamp at dusk, just as the sun was disappearing behind the tall, twisted trees. A low fog crept along the ground, covering the dirt path leading to the entrance. The sound of insects and birds was constant, but there was something else. A low, rhythmic sound like soft splashes on the water. As I walked, I began noticing symbols carved into the trees and stones along the way. They were the same drawings Carl had etched into the table, and they were everywhere. The wind carried a stench of decay mixed with the damp scent of the swamp. It felt like the whole place was alive, breathing around me. After about an hour of walking, I came to a clearing where the fog was thicker. At the center, I saw an altar made of stacked stones, covered in moss, and surrounded by extinguished candles. The ground around it was wet, with traces of recent footprints. Kneeling to examine the candles, I noticed dried blood on some of them. While I was there, I heard a sound that froze my blood. Laughter. It wasn't human. It had a distorted tone, like something trying to imitate a voice. I looked around but saw no one. Still, I felt like I was being watched. Then I noticed the shadows. Among the trees, hooded figures began to appear. They didn't move, just watched, like statues. What little daylight remained seemed to vanish, leaving only the swamp's darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound in control. No response. The figures stayed where they were, motionless, but somehow I felt they were smiling beneath their hoods. As I began to back away, I realized the path I'd taken had disappeared. The swamp had shifted, as if it were swallowing me. The sound of bubbling water came from the altar. When I turned back, I saw something moving slowly on the swamp's surface. It was massive, with glowing eyes that seemed to fix on me. I knew I shouldn't be there, but it was too late to run. The shadows remained still, but the overwhelming sensation that they were getting closer was suffocating. I tried to recall the path back, but the swamp felt like a labyrinth. The altar in the clearing still bubbled, and the glowing eyes in the water had vanished, as though watching me from somewhere else. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. My job was to uncover the truth about what happened to Carl Beaumont, but every instinct in me screamed to run. Except there was no way out. I was trapped in the heart of the dark swamp. The whispers began as I moved, low at first, then rising in volume. They weren't clear words, just fragmented phrases that seemed to enter my mind. "You shouldn't be here. Blood is the only answer." I moved away from the altar, trying to find a landmark, but everything looked the same. Twisted trees, moss-covered stones, and that oppressive fog that hid the ground. Then I noticed something unsettling. The symbols on the trees were changing. What had been mere markings now looked like eyes watching me. I quickened my pace, but soon stumbled into another clearing, larger than the first. At its center was a circle of hooded figures murmuring in a language I didn't understand. On the ground lay a victim, or what remained of them. Their skin was pale, covered in markings identical to Carl's, and their eyes were completely black. I tried to step back, but my foot landed on a branch, snapping it. The sound echoed like thunder, and the figures stopped their murmurs. Slowly, they all turned toward me, their faces still hidden beneath their hoods. "He's here. The next has arrived." The voice came from a larger figure at the center of the circle. He stepped forward, pulling back his hood. His face was covered in scars, etched with symbols like those carved into the trees. His eyes were a glowing, inhuman yellow, and he held a staff made of bones. You came to meet our master. Now he will come to meet you." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the ground itself was holding me in place. The figures began closing in, forming a circle around me. The moonlight disappeared behind heavy clouds, leaving only the swamp's darkness. The water at the center of the clearing began to churn violently, and a deep, guttural roar filled the air. Something began to emerge. At first it looked like a mass of mud and algae, but it quickly became clear it was alive. A colossal head surfaced, covered in eyes that shone like beacons in the darkness. They moved independently, all fixing on me. The creature had long skeletal arms that ended in sharp claw-like fingers, and its heavy breaths made the ground tremble. "The master demands an exchange," said the man with the staff. "You entered the waters. Now you belong to them." "I don't belong to any of this," I shouted, struggling against the invisible roots holding my legs. The entity leaned closer, one of its massive, glowing eyes just inches from my face. I felt a terrible heat emanating from it, mixed with a stench of decay so vile it nearly made me faint. My mind was on the verge of collapse as images flooded my vision, past sacrifices, people dragged into the depths, and the colossal figure rising to claim more victims. "If you refuse to join us, you must choose," said the man with the staff. "Bring another, or take their place." I understood what he meant. I could leave, but only if I brought someone else to the swamp, someone to take my place in the cycle of sacrifices. The thought of condemning another life to save my own was unbearable, but what choice did I have? Before I could decide, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was pulled into the dark waters. The sensation was one of absolute cold, and everything around me fell silent. The entity's eyes surrounded me, watching as I sank. But instead of dying, I awoke on the swamp's edge at dawn. I was alone, my clothes dry, but my left arm was marked with symbols identical to Carl's. I looked toward the swamp and saw the reflection of the entity in the water. It wasn't done with me. I knew that. When I returned to town and tried to warn the authorities, no one believed me. Carl disappeared again, and the locals continued to avoid the swamp. But at night I still hear the whispers, and I know that one day, when my will falters, I'll have to make the choice: offer another soul or return to the waters myself. The mirror stared back at me as if it were alive. The reflection wasn't mine. It couldn't be. In the mirror, my face was covered in deep wrinkles, my eyes were hollow, and my smile was twisted, cruel. The sound of whispers filled the room, and the figure in the mirror tilted its head. Then it spoke, using my voice, but older, darker. "You will become me soon." I screamed, but no one heard me. It all started a few days ago when I was hired as a guide at Sarabell Manor, one of the oldest houses in Savannah, Georgia, and known for its history of secrets and tragedies. I've always been fascinated by old stories, but I never truly believed in the supernatural. Ghosts were just fabrications to lure tourists, and I thought my job was to bring those stories to life convincingly. The mansion was breathtaking, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floors that creaked with every step. But what stood out the most was the mirror in the grand hall. It was massive, with ornate golden edges carved into the shape of eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. Legend had it that the mirror was a wedding gift from a European merchant to Sarabell, but ever since it arrived, strange things began happening. Visitors were always asking questions about the mirror, and I'd respond with the same story I'd learned during training. Sarabell spent hours in front of it, as if speaking to someone, and after her death, people reported that the reflection showed wrong things. On my first shift as a guide, a group of tourists remarked on how the shadows in the mirror's reflection seemed to move on their own. I dismissed it as a trick of the light. But that night, when I locked up the mansion alone, I decided to take a closer look at the mirror. That's when everything changed. At first, it seemed normal. My reflection stared back at me, nothing out of the ordinary. I ran my fingers along the golden edges, admiring the intricate craftsmanship, marveling at the artisan's skill. But as I studied the mirror, I noticed something in the reflection that made my heart stop. A figure in the background. It was a woman with long hair and an old white dress. She had her back to me, but when I turned to look directly at the hall, there was no one there. Yet in the mirror, the woman was slowly turning toward me. Her face was distorted, as though someone had stretched her skin in unnatural directions, and her eyes glowed like tiny points of light. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion. But that night as I slept, I dreamed of the same figure. She sat before the mirror, brushing her hair, and her soft, distant voice whispered something I couldn't understand. The next day I found an excuse to avoid entering the grand hall. The mansion felt darker, heavier, as though something unseen was watching me. Determined to uncover more about Sarah Bell and her mirror, I went to the local archives. What I found left me even more unsettled. According to old accounts, Sarah Bell believed the mirror was a gateway to another world. She claimed she could speak to spirits and even see the future. But over time, she began complaining that they were trapped in the mirror, trying to get out. Shortly before her death, she wrote in her diary, "The mirror sees more than it should. I hear my own reflection whispering." The diary also noted that anyone who spent too much time before the mirror eventually disappeared. The mirror stole something from them, Sarah wrote. When I returned to the mansion that night, I felt drawn to the grand hall as if something were calling me. The mirror seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as though it had been waiting for me. Despite the fear clawing at me, I approached and stared into my reflection. But this time it wasn't just me. Behind me, in the reflection, I saw dozens of figures, men, women, and children, all standing still, staring directly at me with lifeless eyes. They weren't in the room, only in the mirror. My breathing quickened, and then suddenly my reflection began to change. My reflection winked at me. Not me, the reflection. And then it smiled. "Come," said the voice in the mirror, sounding exactly like mine. I stumbled backward, trying to retreat, but I tripped and fell to the floor. When I looked back, the room was empty. My reflection appeared normal again. But I knew something had changed. The mirror wasn't just an object, it was alive, waiting. And now it knew who I was. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, emitting a high-pitched metallic sound that tore through the silence. The lights that flashed in faded colors made no sense. There was no electricity in the park. Emma grabbed my arm, her pale face reflecting the fear I felt. "Jake, we need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely audible over the booming music of the carousel. We made it to the gates, but they were locked with thick chains that hadn't been there when we arrived. I tried to force them, but it was useless. I looked around looking for another way out, but the park seemed to have changed. The paths we had taken were different, as if the rides had moved. Suddenly, the sound of the carousel stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, looking back. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed in the distance, as if someone was running between the rides. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but all I saw were shadows moving too fast to be human. "Jake," Emma began, but her voice trailed off. I followed her gaze and saw something that chilled me to the bone. Near the Ferris wheel, a figure stood. He was dressed like a clown, but the costume was dirty and torn. His face, partially covered by a faded mask, seemed twisted into a grotesque smile. He didn't move, but I knew he was watching us. "Come on, now!" I pulled Emma by the hand, trying to get us away from there. We ran aimlessly, passing stalls and rides, but the park seemed endless. Every corner took us back to places we had already been, as if we were trapped in a maze. The music came back, but this time it came from all sides, as if the entire park was alive. A mechanical sound mixed with the melody, and I realized that the roller coaster was working. Their rusty cars moved along the tracks by themselves, and children's voices echoed, laughing and shouting, but there was no one there. Emma stumbled and fell beside me. As I helped her up, I noticed something in her hand. She had found a piece of paper on the floor, crumpled and dirty. I unfolded it and saw a list of names written in shaky handwriting. At the bottom, the last two names were ours, Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. "This can't be..." I whispered, feeling panic overcome me. Emma began to cry. Jake, they knew we would be here. Before we could think of another way out, the sound of footsteps came again, closer this time. Shadows began to form around us, and indistinct figures emerged from the rides. They were children, or what was left of them. Their faces were distorted, and their eyes glowed with a dull hue. They began to walk toward us slowly, as if they were surrounding us. The clown appeared again, this time closer. His grotesque grin widened, and he pointed toward the Ferris wheel, now spinning faster. "This way!" I yelled, pulling Emma toward a game booth. We hid behind the counter, trying to control our breathing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that looked like a key hanging from a nail. I grabbed it, hoping it was the key to the gates. "We need to get back to the entrance," I whispered. Emma nodded, and we ran as fast as we could. The figures began to move faster, their screams and laughter filling the air. We reached the gates, and I tried to fit the key into the lock. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. The key turned. The chains fell with a crash, and the gates began to open. But before we could get out, Emma screamed. I looked back and saw that she was being pulled. One of the childlike figures had grabbed her leg, and the others were closing in, dragging her back. "No!" I ran to her, trying to free her, but the shadows were too strong. Emma looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Go, Jake, get out of here." "I won't leave you," I screamed, but the shadows swallowed her completely. I stood still for a moment, unable to process what had happened. Then, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned and saw the clown, his eyes now glowing brightly. I ran. I ran as fast as I could through the gates and throwing myself onto the deserted road. Days later, I found the strength to go back with the police, but the park was no longer there. The place was empty, covered in trees and vegetation, as if the park had never existed. The only thing left was the diary we found, now with 2 more names added to the list: Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the carousel music.